It's difficult for us to do a cost-benefit analysis on the relationship between freedom and suffering because we get freedom, and one of the consequences of that seems to be human suffering, but we can't see from our current vantage point the whole benefit, because so much benefit is beyond the grave.
And that's the deep worry, I think, about theodicy, that in trying to relate evil to a good God, it rationalizes it in some way, or it gives it a purpose. And the minute you've rationalized evil, or you've given it a purpose, have you turned it into something else? Have you kind of reduced its awfulness? Have you abridged its awfulness? Have you diluted its awfulness in some way?
One approach, and you certainly find it in some of the interpreters of Irenaeus, is to look at misery, not just one person's misery in their own lives, or the extent to which one person feels evil, but as a species, as a project, as a creative entity, and think, perhaps it's for something, perhaps it will take us somewhere, perhaps there's a reason. We may not know what it is, and this is where, for at least many Christians, the idea of faith comes in, that God must have a reason for it, even if we can't quite perceive what that is.
The experience of some people that suffering has made them better in a number of ways, perhaps just simply by creating character, or deepening faith, or deepening understanding.
The third way that sometimes people respond to extreme suffering is simply to lose the capacity to respond or experience suffering at all. And we can see that in the example of the so-called Musulmana, the people, men and women, in the death and concentration camps who became, as it were, zombies. They had simply lost the capacity to feel. Their humanity had been erased entirely. So I think one shouldn't sentimentalize human responses to suffering. They don't necessarily make you a better person. They can simply erase your humanity.
One interesting question about God's omnibenevolence is, does the fact that God loves us and God feels all warm and benevolent towards us mean that he would never let us suffer? Is actually the more loving thing to do, as Christian ethics sometimes say, actually to let us suffer?
People often say, of course, that God is testing them, or has shown them certain things through a time of suffering or something like that, and then perhaps deduce from that that God actually did some evil to them in order to bring about that good, or to show love to them. There's nothing to say that anyone is wrong in thinking that, I think. However, as an explanation for generally for a case of suffering, it seems to be problematical.
Predominantly, the free will defence is effective to the extent that it works in dealing with moral evil, because it addresses human choices, human free will, and the consequences of those choices.
Some free will defenders have argued that natural evil can be sourced to the actions of the devil. And at first glance, it appears to be an attractive argument, because of course you can then say, yes, it is the free acts of the devil. These are the source of acts, events of natural evil.
The approach of Irenaeus, or those who represent him to us in the modern world, obviously deals with natural evil most clearly and most effectively. In some respects, it does deal with moral evil. To some extent, it deals with it in relation to free will still, but it frames it slightly differently. It suggests that in order for us to go through this learning process in this difficult, challenging moral environment, we've got to be able to choose in it. We've got to freely choose. So the approach of Irenaeus to the problem of evil deals with natural evil and moral evil, although with moral evil it still requires this notion of free will to be at the heart of it. It just attends more to the context in which that free will is operated. A potential problem that I'll just flag at the moment that really is important for this, of course, is it starts to see the misery of certain people, the suffering of some humans, as a means to an end.
If core to John Hick's Era and End theodicy is this sense that we are in a soul-making process, we are moving from moral and spiritual immaturity to moral and spiritual maturity, and our way through that seems to be a context of both moral and natural evil, then it does appear as though John Hick's vision is uncomfortably close to saying, isn't then this soul-making process going through moral acts, being worked out through moral acts and the events of natural evil?
So Irenaeus seems to argue that in order to justify the full gamut of human misery and suffering in the world, ultimately, everyone will be saved.
But if everyone, in the end, meets God, where does that leave evil? If God finds some way, always, of drawing people through evil to God, doesn't that sound suspiciously close to God employing evil as a means to an end?
If the natural world is meant to be a place where we develop, we transform ourselves, and much contemporary theology is very much uses the idea of evolution, morally, it's not that clear that we're evolving. On one hand, we have people say, actually we are. If you look at the way in which people have ideas about gender and about race, these ideas have moved forward significantly. On the other hand, of course, the world is full of war and misery and suffering and poverty and starvation in the face of great richness elsewhere. And one thing that seems clear is that the evils in the world don't seem to be teaching us. It's the most awful things that we seem to repeat. So there's a question here, how much evil is enough?
Asking that sort of question appears obscene, doesn't it, when you're faced with the Holocaust or you're faced with a tsunami? Because what is the point of those sorts of intensities of evil? They seem to be without point. So I think I'd prefer to say there isn't anything purposive about evil, although there are things that we can learn from evil.
I suppose the response from some forms of theodicy would be to say, yes, but we can only see so far. We can't see what happens beyond the grave and the additional learning that might take place, and that only God has the whole picture. So the huge range of human suffering in the world as we encounter it, and others encounter it as well, is justified by what's often referred to as universal salvation. The idea we ultimately will be this process which has begun with our birth in the world will not end at the grave, but will continue after death, forwards into the future, till we eventually, as it were, get the point and transform ourselves into these wondrous beings, which is all we potentially can be. That deals with one of the problems with the theodicy of Irenaeus. There may be other difficulties that that doesn't deal with. One of the potential problems is that the amount of evil, if we think of just how much suffering there is in the world, if suffering's there to make the world a genuinely testing, dangerous, authentic, risky environment, we can perhaps to some extent understand why that's the case. But does there have to be quite so much of it?
The God who causes suffering is not to be justified even by lifting the suffering later. No heaven can rectify Auschwitz.
During the Holocaust in Auschwitz, God's face was hidden or turned away, that God concealed God's self. No, either God did so because that is simply part of the abyssal mystery of God. Our God is a God who turns his face, as the Bible so often avers. For others, though, it was necessary for God to turn his face in order to preserve human freedom.
Some people feel that allowing evil can never surely be an expression of God's love.
I think the only way in which one might answer the question positively, at least generally positively, is to go back again to creation, where it may be an entailment of creating as an act of love that people might have to suffer evil.
And of course there's another problem with this, is that Irenaeus seems to be suggesting that ultimately salvation's for everybody. But if ultimately the greatly evil people, people who have been awful, done dreadful, awful things and inflicted pain and misery without concern on other humans, are going to go to heaven, you start to perhaps worry about the nature of God's justice.
I think the way I would put it, though, is not that one can understand the purposes of evil, but that ultimately God is in control of this world, and ultimately he is going to put things right.
If we can understand evil, bad things, as having some purpose, perhaps we can tolerate them better, perhaps we can endure the world and the miseries it places upon us slightly better, if we know there's a reason behind it.
That, I think, is probably why the theme of the devil retains some of its currency, because the personification of evil with reference to the devil is, I think, in the main is not very helpful. But when you're faced with an evil circumstance which doesn't seem to be traceable to an individual, then the whole notion of ascribing evil to this figure who is other to us as individuals, I think, well, you can see why it becomes attractive.
You have the book of Job, and here is Job, who is emphatically a righteous, innocent man, afflicted with all sorts of terrible things. And the point of that book is to say, look, you can't see the connections here. There are connections, ultimately, in terms of sort of heavenly vision, but not in terms of anything that any of us on earth can observe.
The problem of evil, then, has numerous aspects, and through looking at the work of St. Augustine, we've begun to deal with the problems raised by the nature of evil itself and his attempt to deny it. We've also looked at how that really leads us to freedom of the will, and how the free will defence is a key aspect of this approach, and how the free will defence says to us, human freedom, that's where you blame people for bad actions, leaves to some extent natural evil, unless we're willing to accept that natural evil is a result of sin entering a perfect world through the fall. We perhaps have to have another explanation. This other explanation can be possibly through Irenaeus and the idea of human free choice being something we must operate in a dangerous place where our choices have to be for real. It's no good having fake choices, as it were. Sometimes when I suggest the problem of evil or present it to people in the logical form, you get one response which is quite notable. One response I often get is people saying, well, you can't have good without evil.
Again, good and evil are, I think, contrastive terms. And in order to know what evil is, you would need to know what good is. And I think there is evidence from disciplines such as sociology that there isn't common agreement across all cultures as to what good is and what evil is.
I'm not sure that it's helpful to think about good and evil in a very dualistic way, as if they're polar opposites of one another. Certainly in Judaism, we tend to think of good and evil in slightly more fluid and ambivalent ways.
But you do encounter quite often the idea that good and evil are like things sometimes called necessary counterparts. You would put it in rather formal language. We could say good and evil are necessary counterparts. That is to say, you can't have one without the other.
I'm not particularly fond of the Leibnizian notion of God having or possibly creating the best of all possible worlds. I'm not sure that that makes sense. Nonetheless, I'm absolutely convinced that it would be possible for God to have created a world in which people freely, by their own inclination, wish to choose the good, or at least are born with an inbuilt sense of empathy and compassion for others that would make victimization of others repugnant to them.
I think the idea of a world that is all good in which there's no evil is essential to a theological concept, biblical theological concept.
That is the ultimate Christian hope, that we will live in a new heaven and earth where there's no crying and pain and suffering.
How important it is to kind of explore that, I'm not sure. I mean, John Hick explores it, grants the logical point, but then in a way says that doesn't appear to be the world in which we live. So what is the kind of benefit of thinking in those sorts of terms?
Another approach which is sometimes used, which again is really a concealed form of the arguments we've already looked at, is an aesthetic analogy. An analogy drawn from the idea of kind of art. The idea that contrast is important, that if we didn't have extreme evil in the world, and we certainly appear to have it, if we didn't have the depths of misery and evil and suffering in the world that we do have, we wouldn't be able to have the heights of selflessness and virtue and morality that some people believe we encounter in the world.
I don't think you need evil to make you, let's say, love people.
As a theologian, I'm not particularly interested in heroic virtue, in the grand, tragic virtues. I think that what really matters in life, what actually keeps the world going from day to day, are virtues, ordinary virtues, homely, domestic virtues, like compassion, cooperation, kindness.
One thing that I haven't talked about much, but I will briefly mention, is something called process theodicy.
If you understand theodicy strictly, process theodicy is not a theodicy. By that I mean a strict interpretation of theodicy insists that God's three attributes are maintained. Those attributes are omnipotence, omniscience, and omnibenevolence. The process position amends the first.
That's to say, God seems to say in process theodicy, I'm going to limit my power on purpose. Now, there's a potential paradox before we get going with that by saying, is it feasible that God can say, I'm going to limit my power so I can't interfere in the world anymore, but then if he wants to, if God wants to interfere after that, can God not break that limitation? Because if God can't break that limitation, God isn't all-powerful. But if God can break that limitation, God can't have placed it effectively in the first place and isn't all-powerful. So paradoxes are plenty away anyone thinking about process theodicy.
So if anyone's confused about these arguments about God, then does this mean that like God doesn't exist, or is or that the belief isn't there, that God doesn't really do all of what we think?
Well, I don't think it means that we have to look at the alternative ways of thinking about these things. But is universal salvation compatible with a God of love and justice?
So do you think these other arguments are valid?
I think whether the arguments are valid, it sort of comes down to a matter of opinion. I mean, sort of at the end of the day, it's people's beliefs. I mean, what does everyone believe, sort of thing.
Yeah.
One of the difficulties with believing that ultimately everyone reaches salvation, even if it is through an extended learning process beyond the grave after death, is whether or not it's compatible with justice. There are those who worry about it, who feel that justice demands punishment. But these perhaps misunderstand how Christianity has thought about the nature of God, not just as a just God, but also as a forgiving God. And also the idea that people have an opportunity to continue learning. Maybe this learning beyond the grave isn't wholly pleasant, just as learning prior to death might be unpleasant. People who sin very gravely may have to continue learning in ways they don't like, and therefore justice might be served in some other respect. The challenge to theistic belief is that if you can't find a credible explanation for how an all-living, all-powerful God allows apparently innocent people to suffer in so many seemingly needless ways, your belief is incoherent. And I think it's fairly reasonable to expect people, if they're going to hold beliefs which affect the way they act, if people are going to hold beliefs that impact on other people, that they have a duty towards those beliefs to at least try and make them coherent and reasonable. So I think, although some people might want to escape it through claiming that it's a mystery and they don't understand it, but I'm sure it's okay, then actually if their beliefs do have an effect on me and other people, then they really have some responsibility towards their beliefs to make sure they make some sense, to try and deal with them and engage with them.
There are a number of Jewish theologians who've done so. One thinks of perhaps David Blumenthal quite recently, or Elie Wiesel. And they've really said that the Holocaust was an injustice, it was countenanced by God, and to some extent they're not going to forgive God for that. They continue to love God. They certainly don't deny the existence of God, but they are angry with God, and it will take a long time, if ever, for them to forgive God. And I think that's a difficult notion for some people to, as it were, get their head around, that there is this intimacy with God, this familial relationship that means that one can be angry with God, but also continue to love God and worship God and have a rich life of prayer.
The range of other arguments about the problem of evil exist, but sometimes really they're just the ones to do with free will and the nature of the world in disguise or rephrased. Often you find a logical form of one of them in what's called the necessary counterpart argument, where really you say, well surely in order to have good you've got to have evil. Which isn't that far away in some respects from the free will argument, or from some approaches which are given an aesthetic twist, that somehow contrast is important in order to have great virtue, great wisdom, great kind of goodness in the world. We must also have the depths of kind of wickedness and immorality and evil and ugliness. So that's another approach. One approach, in a sense, is a more existential approach, I suppose, to say, look, it's no good debating what other kinds of world God might have created. God has, for whatever reasons, created this one, and really the sensible thing is to stop worrying about it and get on with making the best of it.
I think I'm very wary about explanations of particular sufferings or particular evils or catastrophes which try to make connections between them and some particular purpose of God.
So evil has no purpose, has no educative function, I don't think, although we might learn something from it.
Evil, and particularly radical evil, for me is an ethical question. It's a question of moral choice. One chooses to commit evil, one has a victim. It's willed, it's conscious.
I think in some ways what's important about the problem of evil for believers is not so much that they feel they solve the problem or that they can demonstrate to other people they can get out of the problem or get out of the issue or completely remove the obstacle. In a way, what's important about it, what's valuable, is that it makes them engage with their ideas. It makes them be self-critical. It makes them consider the suffering of other people and makes them really get tangled up in the issues that matter about their belief and take it seriously. Not just think it's something they just do and that's no problem, I've solved it, but rather really get to grips with issues about suffering, misery and unhappiness, and that is more than more likely to make people want to do something about them. So the problem of evil isn't just a theoretical problem that odd people in theology departments bicker about. Rather, the problem of evil is a genuine challenge to theistic belief. It says, you can't believe in that kind of God. Look at the world, look what it's like. It is not genuinely acceptable to believe that. It doesn't make sense, it's incoherent. So the way in which people respond to the problem of evil isn't just an academic or paper exercise, but is a genuine challenge to everybody who wants to or does believe in a God which is all-living and all-powerful.
Why is there any misery in the world? Not by chance, surely. From some cause, then. Is it then from the intention of the deity? But he is perfectly benevolent. Is it contrary to his intention? But he is almighty. Nothing can shake the solidity of this reasoning.
So